from campus somewhere else, we are grateful for your presence as well. Our opening hymn will be number 106, Prepare the Way, O Zion. Number 106.
Text.
Reading Paul's letter to the Galatians. The first is Galatians 3, verses 28 and 29. In Christ's family, there can be no division into Jew and non-Jew, slave and free, male and female. Among us, you all are equal. That is, we are all in common relationship with Jesus Christ, and also, since we are all in Christ's family, then we are all descendants of Abraham's famous lineage, heirs according to the covenant promises. The second passage is Galatians chapter 6, verses 1 to 5. Live creatively, friends. If someone falls into sin, forgive that person and restore that person, saving your critical comments for yourself. You might be needing forgiveness before the day's out. Stoop down and reach out to all those who are oppressed. Share their burdens and so complete Christ's law. If you think you are too good for that, you are badly deceived. Make a careful exploration of who you are and the work you have been given, and then sink yourself into that work. Don't be impressed with yourself. Don't compare yourself with others. Each of you must take responsibility for doing the creative best you can with your own life. Be very sure now, you who have been trained to a self-sufficient maturity, that you enter into a generous common life with those who have trained you. Share all the good things that you have experienced. during this Advent season, our Lord, we are most mindful and aware of all the good gifts that you have brought to us. The blessing of living in this community, of sharing a common life with each other day in and day out, the strength we draw as we listen to each other's stories and carry each other's burdens together. How blessed we are. And so this afternoon we come and gather to celebrate a part of this community, those who have been gifted, who will present for us this Readers' Theater. So we thank you for all that are present here, for all that will lead us, and for how we will be stimulated by what we are going to hear now. We give you thanks in the name of Christ. Amen. So Nancy Macky has coordinated this group of Monte Vista Grove residents who are going to join us here on the platform, and Nancy is going to introduce this presentation. So thank you, Nancy, so much for your leadership this afternoon. So please show our appreciation. Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you. Before we start, I'd like us to thank Mark and his crew for working on this sound system. There was no sound whatever when we came in. So let's thank them for all that. Susan Glassbill wrote Trifles, but she was not a playwright at the time. She was a reporter in Iowa for the Des Moines Daily News. And her assignment was a story about a local farmer who had been strangled at home at night in his bed. And his wife was in custody, but she claimed that she knew nothing about it. And Susan Glassbill thought that this is a good opportunity, this is 1916, when women were trying to get noticed enough so that they could vote. So she wrote this play, and it was so successful that the Provincetown Players who put it on moved to New York, and this play was one of the first to start off-Broadway theater. The other playwright who was in this group was Eugene O'Neill. The Provincetown Players became the first modern American regional company, and we know what we can benefit from in Pasadena. I'd like to introduce who is a reader for which part, and then I'll say a few more things about the play. The sheriff, Peters, is Tom Eggebine. His wife, Mrs. Peters, is Donna, his wife. The county attorney is Keith Beebe. The farmer, Hale and Hardy, is Dave Winters. And his wife, Mrs. Hale, is, guess who? It's Rachel. There are some terms in this play I think I'd like to mention because I'm sure that most of us are too young to have known them. A roller towel. How many know what a roller towel is? A few. You young people don't know what a roller towel is. A roller towel is a fabric that is on a loop. And the idea is that you pull it down the loop. It's on a dowel. You pull it down and dry your hands after washing them clean. But sometimes they're not washed clean. And then after that person uses the towel, he or she pulls it down, and the next person is supposed to do the same thing and pull it down to the clean part for the next person. Some of us who have stopped in rest stops who have old roller towels know that somebody doesn't do the laundry. Another term that is used is party line. Anyone know what a party line is? Oh, even more. All right. Well, you remember then that phone connections were expensive. And so to get something that was more reasonable, manageable, they had party lines where several families would use the same line, the same number. Now, how did that work? You could pick up the phone and there might be somebody already having a conversation, and that was someone on your party line. You knew if the phone ringing was for you by the length of the ring. My family was on a party line, only 2 parties on it, but there were many, it's 4. And there are 4 combinations of rings. You could have 2 long, 2 short, a long and a short, or a short and a long. And you had to listen for how long that rang to know whether it was for you or not. So many people got connected with their neighbors when they weren't intending to, because they didn't listen to the length of the ring. But that's what a party line is. It was a way, though, of being connected, and you'll hear about how important that would have been for the farmer's wife. There are terms having to do with handcrafts. We all know what sewing is. Quilting is mentioned, where small pieces of fabric are put together into a pattern. There's another term that is used that some may not know. It's called knotting. And that's, instead of sewing the thread with a needle, take the thread and tie it into knots. And we know that there are many knots. We've seen sailor knots. But you make a knot big enough and tight enough. That's really important, that it won't come loose. And then that knot is applied to a pattern. So that's sewing, quilting, and knotting that you'll hear. I'd like us to have some questions in mind so that you are sleuthing, because unlike Agatha Christie at the end of each mystery, she tells who is guilty and the guilty person is on stage and why the murder was committed. You're not going to find that out by the script. You'll figure it out. So you be the detectives. And afterward, I'd like us to talk briefly about what you discovered. What were the key clues? Why did the women see them and the men did not? And maybe the attitudes of men toward women and women toward men will ring some familiar bells. So here we go to find out who done it. The scene is the kitchen of the now abandoned farmhouse of John Wright. It's a gloomy kitchen and left without having been put in order. Imagine unwashed pans under the sink, a loaf of bread outside the bread box, a dish towel on the table, and other signs of incompleted work. At the rear, the outer door opens and Sheriff Peters comes in. The John Wayne sheriff strides across. He is followed by Farmer Hale, hale and hearty. Then the county attorney. Think with the county, when the county attorney speaks, what does he miss? What clues is he missing in the brief conversation around him? All are much bundled up. It's very cold, and they're followed by their 2 wives, Mrs. Hale, wife of Farmer Hale, she does a lot of work, Mrs. Hale does, and Mrs. Peters, the wife of Sheriff Peters, who is very aware of the law. The women look fearfully about the kitchen. The men have gone directly to the stove. They're not fearful at all. The county attorney speaks, rubbing his hands.
This feels good. Come up to the fires, lady.
The sheriff is unbuttoning his overcoat and steps away from the stove as if to mark the beginning of official business.
Now, Mr. Hale, before we move things about, you explain to Mr. Henderson just what you saw when you came here yesterday morning.
By the way, Sheriff, has anything been moved? Are things just as you left them yesterday?
It's just the same. Hey, when it dropped below zero last night, I thought I'd better send Frank out this morning to make a fire for us. No use getting pneumonia with a big case on. But I told him not to touch anything except the stove.
Somebody should have been
Frank.
left here yesterday.
Oh, yesterday. When I had to send Frank to Morris Center for that man who went crazy, I want you to know I had my hands full yesterday. I knew you could get back from Omaha by today, and as long as I went over everything here myself.
Well, Mr. Hale, tell us what happened when you came here yesterday morning.
Well, Harry and I had started to town with a load of potatoes. We came along the road from my place, and as I got here, I said, I'm going to see if I can't get John Wright to go in with me on a party telephone. I spoke to Wright about it once before, and he put me off, saying folks talk too much anyway, and all he asked was peace and quiet. I guess you know about how much John talked himself. But I thought maybe if I went to the house and talked about it before his wife, though I said to Harry that I didn't know as what his wife wanted made much difference to John.
Let's talk about that later, Mr. Hale. I do want to talk about that, but tell me just now what happened when you got to the house.
Well, I didn't really hear or see anything. I knocked at the door, and still it was all quiet inside. I knew they must be up. After all, it was past 8 o'clock. So I knocked again, and I thought I heard somebody say, come in. I wasn't sure. I'm not sure yet. But I opened the door, this door right here, and there in that rocker sat Mrs. Wright.
They all look at the rocker.
What was she doing?
Well, she was rocking back and forth. She had her apron in her hand and was kind of pleating it.
And how did she look?
Well, she looked rather strange.
How do you mean strange?
Well, as if she didn't know what she was going to do next and kind of done up.
How did she seem to feel about your coming?
Why, I don't think she minded one way or other. She didn't pay much attention. I said, how do, Ms. Wright? It's cold, ain't it? And she said, is it? And went on kind of pleating at her apron. Well, I was surprised. She didn't ask me to come up to the stove or to sit down, but I just sat there and she just sat there not even looking at me. And I said, I want to see John. And then she laughed. I guess you could call it a laugh. I thought of Harry and the team outside in the cold, and so I said, a little sharp, well, can't I see John? No, she says, kind of dull like. Well, ain't he home, says I. Yes, says she. He's home. Well, then why can't I see him? I asked her out of patience, I guess. 'Cause he's dead, says she. Dead, says I. she just nodded her head, not getting a bit excited, just rocking back and forth. "Why, where is he?" says I, not knowing what else to say. And she just pointed to the room above. I got up with the idea of going up there. I walked from here to there, and then I says, "Well, what did he die of?" "What?" And she said, "He died of a rope around his neck." Well, just went on pleating her apron then. Well, I went out and called Harry because I thought I might need some help there. And we went upstairs and
Look, I think I'd rather have you go into that upstairs where we can point it all out. Just go on now with the rest of the story.
well, my first thought was to get that rope off. It looked, but Harry, he went up to him and he said, "No, he's dead all right, and we better not touch anything." So we went back downstairs. She was still sitting the same way. "Has anybody been notified?" I asked. "No," she says, unconcerned. "Well, who did this, Ms. Wright?" said Harry. He said it businesslike, and she stopped, but pleading, and said, "I don't know." "Well, you don't know?" says Harry. "No," says she. "Well, weren't you sleeping in the same bed with him?" says Harry. "Yes," says she, "but I was on the inside." "Well, somebody slipped a rope around his neck and strangled him, and you didn't wake up?" says Harry. "I didn't wake up," she said after him. We must have looked as if we didn't see how that could be. For after a minute, she said, "I sleep sound." Well, Harry was going to ask her more questions, but I said maybe we ought to let her tell her story the first time to the coroner or the sheriff or whomever, and so Harry went fast as he could up to Rivers' place where they've got a telephone.
And what did Mrs. Wright do when she knew that you had gone for the coroner?
Well, she moved from that chair to this little one over here, and she just sat there with her hands together and looking down. I thought a conversation would be in order, so I said I had to come in to see if John wanted to go in with me on a telephone. And at that, she started to laugh. And then she stopped and looked at me, scared.
The county attorney, who's had his notebook out, makes a note.
I don't know. Maybe it wasn't scared. I wouldn't like to say it was. Lloyd came, and you, Mr. Peters, and so I guess that's all I know that you don't.
I guess we'll go upstairs first, and then out to the barn and around there. Now, you're convinced that there's nothing important that happened here, nothing that will point to any motive?
Yeah, nothing here but kitchen things.
The county attorney, after again looking around the kitchen, opens the door of the cupboard closet. He gets up on a chair and looks on a shelf, and he pulls his hand away, sticky.
Ah, here's a nice mess.
The women draw nearer.
Oh, her fruit. It did freeze. She worried about that when it turned so cold. She said that the fire'd go out and her jars would break.
Well, can you beat that woman held for murder and worrying about her preserves?
Well, she's going to have a lot more to worry about than preserves after we're done.
Well, women are used to worrying over trifles.
The two women move a little closer.
And yet, for all their worries, what would we do without the ladies?
He goes to the sink and takes a dipper full of water from the pail and pours it into a basin, washing his hands. He starts to wipe them on the roller towel, and turns it for a cleaner place.
Oh, dirty towels.
He kicks his foot against the pans under the sink.
Not much of a housekeeper, would you say, ladies?
There's a great deal of work to be done on a farm.
Oh, to be sure. And yet, I know there are some Dixon County farmhouses which do not have roller towels.
He gives it a pull to expose its full length again.
Those towels get dirty awful quick. Men's hands aren't always as clean as they ought to be.
Ah, loyal to your sex, I see. But you, Mrs. Wright, were neighbors. I suppose you were friends too?
No, I've not seen much of her in late years. I've not been in this house. It's more than a year.
And why was that? You didn't like her?
Oh, I liked her all well enough. Farmers' wives have their hands full, though, Mr. Henderson.
Yes.
Well, it just never seemed like a cheerful place.
No, it's not cheerful. I shouldn't say that she had the homemaking instinct.
Well, I don't know as Wright had it either.
You mean they didn't get on very well?
No, I don't mean anything. But I don't think a place would be any cheerfuler for John Wright's being in it.
Well, I'd like to talk about that more with you later, but I want to get the lay of things upstairs now.
I suppose anything Mrs. Peters does will be all right. She was to take in some clothes for her, you know, in a few little things. We left in such a hurry yesterday.
Yes, but I would like to see what you take, Mrs. Peters, and keep an eye out for anything that might be of use to us.
Yes, Mr. Henderson.
The women listen to the men's steps on the stairs. Then they look around the kitchen.
I'd hate to have men coming into my kitchen, snooping around and criticizing.
She arranges the pans under the sink, which the lawyer had shoved out of place.
Of course, it's no more than their duty.
Duty's all right, but I guess that deputy sheriff that came out to make the fire might have got a little of that dirt on this roller towel.
She gives the towel a pull.
Wish I'd thought of that sooner. Seems mean to talk about her for not having things slicked up when she had to go away in such a hurry.
Mrs. Peters has gone to a small table in the left rear corner of the room, and she lifts one end of the towel that covers a pan.
She had the bread set.
Mrs. Hale's eyes are fixed on a loaf of bread beside the bread box, which is on a low shelf at the other side of the room, and she moves slowly toward it.
She was going to put this bread in there.
She picks up the loaf, then abruptly drops it.
It's a shame about her fruit. I wonder if it's all gone.
She gets up on the chair and looks.
I think there's some here that's all right, Mrs. Peters. Yes, here.
She holds it toward the window.
This is cherries, too. I declare I believe that's the only one.
She gets down the bottle in her hand and goes to the sink to wipe it off on the outside.
She'll feel awful bad after all her hard work in the hot weather. I remember the afternoon I put up my cherries last summer.
She puts the bottle on the big kitchen table in the center of the room. She's about to sit down in the rocking chair, but before she sits, she realizes what a chair it is, and with a slow look at it, she steps back. The chair which she has touched rocks back and forth.
Well, I must get those things from the front room closet.
She goes to the door at the right, but after looking in the other room, she steps back.
You coming with me, Mrs. Hale? You could help me carry some.
They go in the other room and then reappear. Mrs. Peters is carrying a dress and skirt. Mrs. Hale follows with a pair of shoes to take to Benny.
My, it's cold in there.
She puts the clothes on the big table and hurries to the stove. Mrs. Hale examines the skirt.
Wright kept to himself. I think that's maybe why she kept so much to herself. She didn't even belong to the Ladies' Aid. I suppose she felt she couldn't do her part. And then you don't enjoy things when you feel shabby. She used to wear pretty clothes and be lively when she was Minnie Foster, one of the town girls singing in the choir. But that was 30 years ago. Is this all you was to take in?
See, she said she wanted an apron. Funny thing to want, for there isn't much to get dirty in jail. Goodness knows. But I suppose just to make her feel more natural. She said there was in the bottom drawer in this cupboard. Yes, here. And then her little shawl that always hung behind the door. Yes, here it is.
She quickly shuts the door leading upstairs where the men are.
Mrs. Peters,
Mrs. Hale?
do you think she did it?
Well, I don't think she did. Asking for an apron and her little shawl? Worrying about her fruit?
Mrs. Peters glances upstairs where the footsteps of the men are heard.
Mr. Peters says it looks bad for her. Mr. Henderson is awful sarcastic in a speech. And he'll make fun of her saying she didn't wake up.
Well, I guess John Wright didn't wake up when they was slipping that rope under his neck.
No, it's strange. It must have been done awful crafty, and still, they say it was such a funny way to kill a man, rigging it all up like that.
That's just what Mr. Hale said. There was a gun in the house. He says that's what he can't understand.
Mr. Henderson said coming out that what was needed for the case was a motive, something to show anger or sudden feelings.
Well, I don't see any signs of anger around here.
She puts her hand on the dish towel, which lies on the table, and then she stands looking down at the table and sees that one half is clean and the other half is messy.
It's wiped to here.
She makes a move as if to finish the work and then turns and looks at the loaf of bread outside the bread box and drops the towel.
Wonder how they are finding things upstairs. I hope she had it a little more read up there. You know, it seems kind of sneaking. Locking her up in town and then coming out here and trying to get her own house to turn against her.
But, Mrs. Hale, the law is the law.
Oh, I suppose it is.
She unbuttons her outer coat.
Better loosen up your things too, Mrs. Peters. You won't feel them when you go out.
Mrs. Peters then takes off her fur scarf. She goes to hang it on a hook at the back of the room and then looks at the under part of the small corner table.
She was piecing a quilt.
She brings the large sewing basket and they look at the bright pieces.
It's log cabin pattern. Pretty, isn't it? I wonder, was she going to quilt it or just knot it?
Footsteps are heard coming down the stairs. The sheriff enters, followed by Hale and the county attorney.
Goodness, they wonder if she was going to quilt it or just knot it.
Well, Frank's fire didn't do much up there, did it? Let's go out to the barn and get that cleared up.
They go outside.
I don't know as there's anything so strange. Our taking up our time with little things while we're waiting for them to get the evidence.
She sits down at the big table and smooths out a quilt block with decision.
I don't see as it's anything to laugh about.
Of course, they've got awful important things on their minds.
She pulls up a chair and joins Mrs. Hale at the table with the quilt. Mrs. Hale is examining another block of quilt.
Mrs. Peters, look at this one. Here. This is the one she was working on, and look at the sewing. All the rest of it has been so nice and even. But look at this one. It's all over the place. Why, it looks like she didn't know what she was doing.
They look at each other, then start to glance back at the door. After an instant, Mrs. Hale has pulled at a knot and ripped the sewing.
Oh, what are you doing, Mrs. Hale?
Oh, just pulling out a stitch or two that's not sewed very good.
She threads a needle.
Bad sewing always makes me fidgety.
I don't think we ought to touch things.
Oh, I'll just finish up this end.
She stops suddenly and leans forward.
Mrs. Peters,
Yes, Mrs. Hale?
what do you think she was so nervous about?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. As she was nervous, I sometimes so awful crazy when I'm just tired.
Mrs. Hale starts to say something and then goes on sewing.
Well, I think you need to get those things wrapped up. Because they may be through sooner than we think.
She puts the apron and other things together.
I wonder where I can find a piece of paper and string.
In that cupboard, maybe.
She looks in the cupboard.
Why, here's a bird cage.
She holds it up.
Did she have a bird, Mrs. Hale?
Why, I don't know whether she did or not. I haven't been here for so long. There was a man around here last year selling canaries cheap, but I don't know as she took one. Maybe she did. She used to sing real pretty herself.
Mrs. Peters glances around.
Seems funny to think of a bird here, but she must have had one, or why would she have a cage?
I
I
suppose,
can't wonder what happened to it.
maybe the cat got it.
No, she didn't have a cat. She's got that feeling some people have about cats, being afraid of them. My cat got in her room and she was real upset and asked me to take it out.
My sister Bessie was like that. Strange, isn't it?
Why, look at this door. It's broke. One hinge is pulled apart.
Looks as if someone must have been really rough with it.
Why, yes.
She brings the cage forward and puts it on the table.
I wish if they're going to find any evidence, they'd be about it. I don't like this place.
But I'm awful glad you came with me, Mrs. Hale. It would be lonesome for me sitting here alone.
It would, wouldn't it? But I tell you what I do wish, Mrs. Peters. I wish I had come over sometimes when she was here.
She looks around the room.
Oh, I wish I had.
But of course, you were awful busy, Mrs. Hale. Your house and your children.
But still, I could have come. I stayed away because it weren't cheerful. And that's why I ought to have come. I've never liked this place. Maybe because it's down in a hollow and you don't see the road. I don't know what it is, but it's a lonesome place and always was. I wish I'd come over to see Minnie Foster sometimes. I can see that now.
Well, you mustn't reproach yourself, Mrs. Hale. Somehow we just don't see how it is with other folks until something comes up.
Not having children makes less work, but it makes for a quiet house. And Wright out to work all day, and no company when he did come in. Did you know John Wright, Mrs. Peters?
No, not to know him. I've seen him in town. They say he was a good man.
Yes, good. He didn't drink, and he kept his word as well as most, I guess, and he paid his debts. But he was a hard man, Mrs. Peters. Just to pass the time of day with him, ooh, like a raw wind that gets to the bone.
Her eye falls on the cage.
I should think she would have wanted a bird. But what do you suppose happened to it?
I don't know, unless it got sick and died.
She reaches over and swings the broken door. She swings it again, and both women watch it.
You weren't raised around here, were you? You didn't know her.
Not till they brought her yesterday.
Come to think of it, she was kind of like a bird herself. Real sweet and pretty, but kind of timid and fluttery. How she did change. Tell you what, Mrs. Peters, why don't you take her quilt in with you? It might take her mind off things.
Why, I think that's a real nice idea, Mrs. Hale. There couldn't possibly be any objection to it, would there? Now, just what would I take? I wonder if her patches are in here and her things.
They both look in the sewing basket.
Here's some red. I expect this has got some sewing things in it.
She brings out a fancy box.
What a pretty box. Looks like something somebody would give you. Maybe her scissors are in here.
She opens the box and suddenly puts her hand to her nose.
Why,
Mrs. Peters bends nearer, then turns her face away.
there's something wrapped in this piece of silk.
Why, this isn't her scissors.
Mrs. Hale lifts the silk.
Oh, Mrs. Peters,
Mrs. Peters bends closer to it.
It's the bird.
But Mrs. Peters, look at it. Its neck. Look at its neck. It's all the other side too.
Something wrung its neck.
Their eyes meet. A look of growing comprehension, of horror. Steps are heard outside. Mrs. Hale slips the box under the quilt pieces and sinks into her chair. Enter sheriff and county attorney.
Well, ladies, have you decided whether she was going to quilt it or knot it?
We think she was going to knot it.
Well, that's interesting, I'm sure.
He's looking at the bird cage.
Has the bird flown away?
We think the cat got it.
She puts more quilt pieces to cover it.
Oh, is there a cat?
Mrs. Hale glances in a quick, covert way at Mrs. Peters.
Well, not now. They're superstitious, you know, and they leave. A cat.
Sheriff Powers, there's no sign at all of anyone having come from the outside with their own rope. Let's go up again and go over it piece by piece.
They start upstairs.
It would have to have been somebody who knew just the...
The two women sit there, not looking at one another, but as if peering into something and at the same time holding back. When they talk now, it is in the manner of feeling their way over strange ground, as if afraid of what they are saying, but as if they can't help saying it.
She liked the bird. She was going to bury it in that pretty box.
When I was a girl, my kitten, there was a boy took a hatchet and before my eyes, and before I could get there. If they hadn't held me back, I would have...
She looks upstairs where steps are heard.
hurt him.
I wonder how it would seem never to have had any children around here. No, Mr. Wright wouldn't like the bird, a thing that sang. She used to sing. He killed that too.
We don't know who killed the bird.
I knew John Wright.
It was an awful thing was done in this house that night, Mrs. Hale. Killing a man while he slept, slipping a rope around his neck that choked the life out of him.
His neck choked the life out of him.
Her hand goes out and rests on the bird cage.
We don't know who killed him. We don't know.
If there'd been years and years of nothing, then a bird comes to sing to you, it would be awful, awful still after the bird was still.
I know what stillness is. When we homesteaded in Dakota and my first baby died after he was 2 years old, and me with no other than...
How much longer do you think they'll be before they find evidence?
I know what stillness is. The law has got to punish crime, Mrs. Hale.
I wish you'd seen Minnie Foster when she wore that white dress with those blue ribbons and stood up there in the choir and sang.
She looks around the room.
Oh, I wish I'd come over here once in a while. That was a crime. That was a crime.
Mrs.
Who's going to
Peters looks
punish
upstairs.
that?
We mustn't carry on like this.
I might have known she needed help. I know how things can be for women. I tell you, it's strange, Mrs. Peters. We live close together, yet we live far apart. We all go through the same things, but it's all just a different kind of the same thing.
She notices the bottle of fruit and reaches out for it.
If I was you, I wouldn't tell her fruit was gone. Tell her it ain't. Tell her it's all right. Take this to prove it to her. She may never know whether it was broke or not.
She takes the bottle and looks around for something to wrap it in.
Well, it's a good thing that the men couldn't hear us. Wouldn't they just laugh? Getting all stirred up over a little thing like a dead canary, as if that could have anything to do with wouldn't they laugh?
The men are heard coming downstairs.
Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't.
No, Peters, it's all perfectly clear except a reason for doing it. But you know juries when it comes to women. If there was some definite thing, something to show, something to make a story about, a thing that would connect up with this strange way of doing it.
Enter Hale from the outer door.
Well, I've got the team around. Pretty cold out there.
I'm going to stay here a while by myself. Sheriff, you can send Frank out for me, can't you? I want to go over everything. I'm not satisfied that we can't do better.
Do you want to see what Mrs. Peters is going to take in?
The lawyer picks up the box.
Oh, I guess they're not very dangerous things the ladies have picked out.
He moves a few things about, disturbing the quilt pieces which cover the box, and steps back.
No, Mrs. Peters doesn't need supervising. For that matter, a sheriff's wife is married to the law. Ever think of it that way, Mrs. Peters?
Not just that way.
Married to the law.
He moves toward the other room.
George, we ought to take a look at those windows.
Windows.
We'll be right out, Mr. Hale.
The sheriff follows the county attorney into the other room. Then Mrs. Hale, looking intensely at Mrs. Peters, finally meeting eyes. A moment later, Mrs. Hale holds her, then her own eyes point the way to where the box is concealed. Suddenly, Mrs. Peters throws back the quilt pieces and tries to put the box in the bag she's wearing, but it's too big. So she opens the box, starts to take the bird out, but cannot touch it. There's a sound of a knob turning in the other room. Mrs. Hale snatches the box and puts it in the pocket of her big coat.
Well, Henry, at least we found out that she was not going to quilt it. She was going to, what is it you call it, ladies?
She was going to knot it, Mr. Henderson.
End of the play. Thank you. Thank you. That was terrific. All right, what did you think were some of the important clues that the women were picking up. Anyone would take the mic around? Is there a mic? Is there a mic that works? Okay. Anyone? What were some of the important clues? Yeah, Carol's over here.
That John had a terrible temper and didn't like pretty things like a bird song.
Why is that important?
Because he was so unlike his wife.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Other clues? Did you pick up the clue? Okay, good.
The broken jar of fruit jam, or the mess in the cabinet.
That was important. Why do you think it was?
I think it might speak to either an intruder, or it might, that's okay. It might speak to the anger of the husband, but I suspect there's been an intruder. I also want to know about the rope.
It was their rope, yeah. Go ahead, Suzette. Also about the jam, it was mentioned that it was a very cold room and that the fire should have been kept so that the fruit jars would not freeze. And when they freeze, the fruit expands. And so that would have caused it. And so it was Wright's fault for not keeping the fire going that she lost her fruit. Yeah, Suzette?
Well, I just keep thinking in my mind the connection between this whole issue of knotting
Yes.
and
good.
how knots are made, and of course a rope, a noose with the knots. That might be far-fetched, but
Because to be effective, it had to be knotted very tightly around his neck. She had to do it very quickly. And notice so many places in this play, hands are mentioned. From the very beginning, when the men go in the room, they cross it to the stove and put their hands there. They talk about the dirty men's hands that caused the towel to be unkempt. Yeah, all right.
Who else?
Someone else, another group? All right. What, okay. Good.
Well, no one's mentioned the obvious one. Someone rang the neck of the bird, like you would. I mean, that's the most obvious one to me. And she wouldn't kill her own bird, so.
Right, and they talk in the beginning, there's a connection with that, with the phone, with the party phone. Because we learned early on a clue that the county attorney dismisses by interrupting it. Find that he was not a person who liked sound. He liked it. He didn't want the phone because people talk too much anyway. So he did not want to have that party line, that connection with other people.
I'm wondering if the rough sewing that excuse me, that one lady pulled out
Yes.
indicated something as well. With the big knot, she was able to just pull it out.
That was an important clue because it showed that the sewing was even to a point, and then something was wrong with the sewing. So that and the bread being out of the box and the table being half clean showed that she was interrupted by something, and she was upset enough not to go back and complete what our wife would do. There was an interruption showing anger. Mm-hmm. Anyone else?
An inside piece of information coming here.
As the sheriff has something to say about this.
Yeah, as I was going through the play, one of the things that caught my attention was the fact that the bird had started decomposing. So the bird had been dead for at least several days if it's cold weather, and she wrapped it very carefully in silk And so it meant a great deal to her. And she had time
That's right.
to stew.
Yep, that's right. Yep, that's right. Any other clues that stood out for you? What do you think about the two women who decide not to tell what evidence they found that pointed directly to her? What do you think about that decision? Mrs. Peters, who's the wife of the sheriff, through this little play mentions about the men have to do their work, the men have important work, the law has to be followed. But she then, at the end, she agrees, without saying so, not to expose it. Why do you think that is? There's Bruce over here. Couple here. Because it's a change in the women. They change enormously through this little play.
I think the women felt that it was justifiable homicide.
So it seems.
Woo,
Here's
all
another-
right, we're getting into it now.
Here's another Carlene one. Okay. Wait, no.
This is the perfect final word.
Hold it to your mouth.
I think his is the perfect final word, actually, because I agree with him. And I think the women, I think they felt some guilt, the one particularly, that she had not called on
Exactly.
someone who had, she had observed in the past as having had a nice voice, having been a sweet person, having had life in her. And they started seeing clues of this, quote, justifiable homicide. And I think they both changed at that point.
They did. And it's surprising in such a short play that characters can make such a radical change. But because of their own experience and Mrs. Hale's feeling of her complicity by neglecting to come in and be a neighbor to her, that she had some guilt. What about what Mrs. Hale said about her experience? How does she identify? Do you remember how she might identify Mrs. Peters? She talks about an earlier experience when she was a child and about her pet being abused and how angry she got and how if someone had not intervened, we assume she doesn't finish the sentence, but she would have been violent to the person who had done. So we have these two women identifying, first of all, when they arrive, they think they have no role whatever. They're just waiting for the men to get the evidence. And of course, the kitchen is the woman's place. And so the men are going to find, of course, everything that is important has to be outside of the kitchen. Did you hear any evidence of the women's attitude toward men that was disparaging? Okay, we have a phone. We have the mic. There's someone over here. Carlene is over here. She has.
Who wants the mic?
Carlene said yes. Okay.
Just the comment that men have important work to do.
Yeah, that's good. And Jeannie over here, Terry. Terry behind you, Jeannie over here.
Well, she said sometimes men's hands aren't so clean.
Yes, yes, that's right. And we find out that the man with the dirtiest hands is a man who was murdered. You know, his life.
So Nancy, did you say this thing was written in 1916?
1916. That was 4 years before the 19th
Okay,
Amendment.
so
4 years before the women got the vote.
yeah, so clearly, the author
That's Susan
is,
Glassell.
is drawing a distinction there. The men are dismissing anything that the women have to say.
Absolutely.
Whereas the women, of course, are really doing the more significant sleuthing.
They are.
And it has to do with the dead bird and the knots. And
Yes,
that's
the
as far as
women-
my
yeah.
sleuthing goes, because I'm
But
just a
you're
guy.
right. You're absolutely right. Yes, the women are the ones who are supposed to be just sitting and waiting for the men to find the evidence. And the women pay attention to what's around them. And there's so many clues that they put one, like a quilt. They piece this little bit of evidence and that little bit until they come to the conclusion that they know what happened. And then there's that moral choice. Should we tell the men who we respect for having important work to do, should we tell them or not? And they choose compassion. And they become complicit in some way, too. So, well, thank you very much for listening. Thank you to the cast, are just marvelous. Thank you. So,
Thank you, Nancy, and thank you, cast. This completes our offerings of convocation for 2024, and we will begin again in January, on the 9th of January, not the 2nd, but on the 9th, the second Thursday in January. So we'll see you then. Thanks for coming.
thank you.